Is there any place in business for human rights? I mean, nobody wants to be whipped at your desk or anything like that, but can you make human rights pay? Why don't we get a view from Kayum Ahmed, who is the Chief Executive of the Human Rights Commission in South Africa. Give me a sense of it. Human rights, business, the two almost like oil and water, aren't they?
Well, this is one of the arguments and perspectives that's often put forward by business, but the reality is that the two are intrinsically connected. We look at the Marikana Commission of Inquiry at the moment, where we're looking at the behavior of police in relation to the workers that were killed, but at the same time also looking at the responsibility of Lonmin, the mining company that was responsible to some extent for some of the challenges that were affected and reflected in the Marikana tragedy. So there definitely is a link between business and human rights. I think what we need to establish is what is business's responsibility in terms of promoting and protecting human rights, and of course at the same time what is the other potential partner's responsibility, whether it's the municipalities or government's responsibility. And I think these connections are something that's important to explore.
It becomes very, very complicated though, because on the one hand you've got the corporate responsibility and almost Lonmin as an entity, its responsibility to its workers, but you look at Anglo Platinum in the same belt, of course affected by the same issues as Lonmin has been affected, saying it wanted to fire 12,500 workers at the beginning of this year. Government went completely ballistic, saying, hold on a second, you've got to look at the social consequences of your financial decisions. And that, of course, has sent Anglo Platinum into a tailspin, and it is yet not been able to restructure as a result of governments pushing back against what should be an economic decision.
Sure. So that's the fine balance I think that we need to achieve. The one is the economic imperatives for a particular company, and the bottom line is clearly what they're interested in. But there are also other consequences. And human rights, the big question is, does human rights pay? And the ultimate question, the ultimate answer is yes, it does. I think that if companies structure their work in a way which promotes and protects human rights, there will ultimately be benefits for the workers, but also for the company. And I think perceptions of companies are very important and play an important role in the bottom line. You have international companies such as Starbucks, which of course in the coffee industry, who uses fair trade as a basis for promoting their products, and people then buy coffee because they are aware that the farmers who we are buying coffee beans from are being treated in the proper way. And I think this plays an important fundamental role. There's also a responsibility for government, of course. We look at the way in which South Africa engages with China, and China's human rights record has been particularly challenging. So when a visa is denied to the Dalai Lama, are there business interests involved in that particular decision as well? So it's a very complex issue, and I think it's an important one that we need to debate and discuss a lot more.
But here you've got the issue of human rights. Now, a company will say, my responsibility is to my workers. My responsibility is to the people that I can sustain. So therefore, I become unsustainable. I have to sack 50,000 rather than 12,000 because I eventually shut up shop. It becomes a very difficult social versus human rights versus the capitalist imperative.
Sure.
And that balance is almost impossible to draw, surely.
I think it is impossible to draw. I don't think there'll ever be a perfect balance. There's always going to be a vested interest who's not going to be happy with a particular decision that we take in relation to a human rights issue. I think the bottom line, though, is that we need to look at the best interests of as many of the stakeholders as possible, including business, because we realize that we can't have jobs, we can't have economic prosperity without businesses. So it's also important to ensure that businesses are protected and that their rights are also protected. Often the human rights dilemma is drawn between business on the one hand and seen as the bad guy, and workers who are seen as the good guys and the poor and the marginalized, but it's not always as clear-cut as that. And I think that balance, as you correctly point out, is very critical.
But in a society where so many people are marginalized, probably 40% of South Africans are marginalized, live below the breadline, dependent on some kind of state grant in order simply to survive. I mean, that's the real human rights issue, isn't it? Surely the business issue is not... it's on the table, but surely it should be a side issue to the fundamental issue, which is complete deprived lifestyles of people in South Africa.
Well, the argument is partly correct, because the government has the overwhelming responsibility to ensure that human rights are promoted and protected. But they are clearly very important stakeholders. We recognize that government can't function effectively without business, and business can't function with government.
Somebody pays the tax to provide the funding for the social grant.
Exactly, and this is precisely the interconnection. There's also clearly roles and responsibilities in terms of the community, for example, that a mining company sets up and establishes. Schooling, housing, basic services is certainly something that the mining company needs to take some responsibility for. The same perhaps with large farms, with migrant workers that come into the farming communities. So all of those relationships are absolutely critical and intersect at some point.
The free market guys will say, well, the market will determine the level of employment.
Sure.
And the state is responsible for the rest. Is the state dropping the ball here?
The state has certainly dropped the ball, and I think the Human Rights Commission has said this over and over again. But at the same time, we also need to ask the same question of business. Has business dropped the ball? Has business even come on board? Some have argued that during the anti-apartheid struggle, business was the very last stakeholder to come on board. After government had made decisions, civil society, international community, and business was the last players to come on board. And they tend to sort of move depending on the status quo at that particular time. So critical questions have to be asked about business leaders as well, and what responsibility do they have to also take accountability and ownership of the current challenges we face as a country.
So maybe the question is, not are human rights affordable, but can we afford to not pay attention to human rights?
Absolutely. Critical question. I think this is precisely what I've seen personally. I visited very recently a number of communities across the country looking at access to water and sanitation, and also the role of businesses in the utilization of water and the pollution of water and the impact that has on communities. And communities across the country are angry. They are shouting at government officials, they are shouting at business leaders for failing to take accountability and ensure that basic services are provided to those communities. So critical questions must be asked of government leaders and of course of business as well. And the reality is that you can't have a situation where human rights are sidelined and marginalized in the best interest of the bottom line. I think that is a belief and a system of thinking that's no longer relevant.
We talk about triple bottom line reporting, and of course it's about social and economic and all of these sorts of things. It's about the future sustainability of business. Surely the ultimate bottom line is, in an unequal society where human rights are trampled on and ignored from both business and government in many cases, you don't have a sustainable society. Without a sustainable society, your business is not sustainable. This is about survival.
Absolutely, and again, the bottom line becomes a critical issue here for business. Without ensuring a sustainable society, you're going to have very major difficulties in ensuring that you are going to be able to have a base that supports your particular business. And so it's important to ensure that that base is constantly protected and not marginalized. And I think the two work absolutely hand in hand. And businesses, I think, have slowly begun to realize this. There are businesses who are very active and proactive in the way in which they engage with communities. And particularly in the food sector, you're beginning to see a lot more support for small farmers to be able to provide organic produce to big supermarket chains. But there are also businesses that are reluctant to come on board.
Who's doing it best?
That's a very good question. I unfortunately don't have a straight answer there. I would have to do a proper analysis of the situation. But there are businesses in the coffee industry. We've seen some significant changes in the way in which they approach issues. But challenges again remain, say, in the beef industry, where there are a number of businesses who continue to flout regulations and who behave badly in that particular industry. So it really is a difficult one to give a straight answer to.
Kayum Ahmed, thanks very much. He is the Chief Executive of the Human Rights Commission.